Okay, so welcome everyone to this Health Services Research Association of Australia and New Zealand webinar. It's really nice to see you all. And a big welcome to Melissa McCradden, who's joining us as our presenter today. So Melissa works at the Women's and Children's Health Network Artificial Intelligence Unit and is the director there, and the Hospital Research Foundation Group Clinical Research Fellow in Ethics of AI at the Australian Institute for Machine Learning at the University of Adelaide. She's also an adjunct scientist with Sick Kids Research Institute and was listed amongst the top 100 brilliant women in AI ethics in 2022. So this is a really big emerging area in healthcare at the moment and the use of AI. And obviously in health services research, there's a lot of ways, or in health services, there's a lot of ways that AI could be used to change the way health services are provided. And so whilst there's a lot of excitement around some of those, there's also a lot of work that needs to be done around the ethics of them. So we're really delighted to have Melissa here talking to us about her work. And so her presentation is AI's Canary in the Coal Mine, the ethical significance of silent translational trials for healthcare machine learning. And so what I'll do is I'll hand over to Melissa now. She'll do the presentation, which will be kind of 30 to 40 minutes. If you could hold your questions or pop them in the chat during the presentation, and then at the end of the formal presentation, we'll have time for questions and discussion. It'd be great to hear if other people are working in this area and get some more clarification from Melissa on her content at the end. I did just realize that I totally forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Alison Pearce. I'm a health economist at the University of Sydney, in particular at the Daffodil Centre. But I'm also the president of the Health Services Research Association of Australia and New Zealand. So it's lovely to have you here, Melissa. I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. Hope you can see my slides okay. Cool, all right. So first, by way of disclosures, my work is supported by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, Hospital Research Foundation Group, as well as AMO. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that I work and live from, which is the traditional territory of the Kaurna peoples. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And today I'm presenting to you from my home in Adelaide Hills, which is the traditional territory of the Paramank people. One of the traditions from Canada is to say what the land acknowledgement means in the context of the presentation today. So for me, what this means is how important it is to engage and partner with Aboriginal consumers, with scholars, with knowledge holders in the context of doing AI, because this is a technology that fundamentally is about power. And so the people who are most disadvantaged by those power systems need to have a stronger voice in its governance. And so for all of my work here, I've partnered with the Aboriginal Health Unit at Women's and Children's, as well as some of my colleagues at the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute, or Wardley Pringa. So what I'll talk about today is I'm going to discuss the limitations of technical performance as an indicator of the merits of a given AI tool. I'll talk about the role of equipoise and how this might apply to AI integration, and then describe how translational or silent trials provide the necessary paradigm to inform equipoise. I'll also talk a little bit about why I'm using the term translational versus silent trials. So obviously, we've all heard a lot about artificial intelligence in medicine. Way back in 2016, a certain someone who is very famous and recently won a prize in chemistry for some reason proclaimed that radiologists would be extinct by the year 2021. They are not extinct. Radiologists are some of the people who are leading a lot of research in AI in healthcare. And so what I kind of use this to illustrate is that there's a lot of things that have been said about what AI can do for medicine, and a lot less research about showing what it actually does. And so my work really looks to bridge that gap, to look at what is evidence in the context of AI, what kind of evidence do we need, what is the right kind of evidence to help us justify decisions that we make, both about adopting a system across an entire health network, as well as how do we justify the decisions we make about patients when using AI systems. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this space. We know and we are seeing that AI tools can improve things like prioritization within workflows. They can provide clinically meaningful alerts to help support patient care. They can introduce some efficiencies in care management, and they can help us mobilize resources based on individual patient needs. However, all AI tools are not created equal. The very same tool that might work at one hospital can fail at another. Some tools use shortcuts and confounders and still show good predictive accuracy. Still others are accurate, but not clinically actionable or superior to the standard of care. One of the kind of key examples on this last point is the EPIC sepsis detection algorithm that was used widespread across the United States. This was touted as having over 90% accuracy for detecting patients with sepsis. But when they actually prospectively evaluated the tool, it was found to identify only 17% of patients who had sepsis. Now, we could have an absolutely perfect algorithm that identifies every case of sepsis, but it might only be identifying the cases that the clinicians are already treating. And so then it's not clinically actionable. So there's this sort of tension between having an AI system that is really accurate versus an AI system that is very useful. We also know that AI tools can propagate both systematic inequalities such as bias and fairness, as well as arbitrary performance differences. So in many ways, they replicate the very same patterns of inequality within our healthcare systems, but they can also make random mistakes that a human would not make. So how do we deal with this system where these are the types of mistakes that we're presented with? Well, one of the things is to stop assuming that they work perfectly. This is an excellent paper by Deb Raji and colleagues. Deb Raji is one of the people who basically invented the field of fairness in machine learning. And this was a review of nearly 300 cases of systems that were deployed in the world, were being used in the real world. And what they found was that nearly all of them had failures, and they're quite common. And so they broke them down into these types of failures that we see. Now, one of the things that always kind of impacts me is that when I look at a lot of the ethics guidelines, I don't always see any indication of whether we're assessing functionality in a lot of these tools. And I think this study really highlights that when we think about that, we have these beliefs that these systems work well, but actually when you measure it, there's a lot of reasons why they might fail. And where people are grounding this belief is this idea of technical performance. So when an algorithm is accurate, what it really means is that we have some data set where we might have some labels, and we've trained a model to learn patterns that are associated with those labels. So if it's a tumor is present or absent, the model essentially learns which features are associated with a tumor being present and which ones with a tumor being absent. We would then get a new set of cases, and then we run that same algorithm to see how often it's able to correctly classify whether a tumor is present or absent. That is where we get a lot of those markers of accuracy. However, if I know many of you are in health systems research, and so no doubt it's not a surprise to you that just because we can detect something correctly doesn't always mean we can use it to benefit patients. And certainly this has been true with AI as well. This is a case where they found, I think this is actually one of the living review projects where they've looked at algorithms to detect COVID-19. Study after study has shown that none of these are actually clinically actionable. There was a number of the models have actually been found to simply be detecting adult versus children because the controls were all coming from children and the COVID cases were all coming from adults. And so models learn a shortcut. They learn that children are less likely to have COVID, adults more likely to have COVID. They trained during the pandemic. And so you can get very high accuracy without actually being indexed to the thing that you're trying to measure. This was the sepsis detection algorithm that I mentioned. Anecdotally, some people have said that they find it works well. Other hospital sites, it doesn't work. They're all using the same EHR system. It's all with Epic. So again, showing that just because it works at one site doesn't mean it works everywhere. And then this is a recent class action lawsuit in the United States where United Health was using an algorithm to predict whether a patient was ready for discharge or not. The health institution basically adopted the model and started using it. Clinicians were alerting administrators to the model's predictions being inappropriate. So the model would say a patient is ready for discharge. The clinician felt differently and would advocate for the patient to stay in the hospital. However, in this case, the administrators made the decision to tell the clinician to follow what the algorithm said and discharge the patient. As a result, a lot of people suffered harm, a lot of people died. And so there is now a class action lawsuit because when they actually evaluated the algorithm prospectively, they found it had incredibly low accuracy, worse than a coin flip at predicting whether or not patients were actually ready for discharge or not in the clinical sense. And then finally, this was done from my colleagues at Duke University, where they nearly deployed an algorithm which they ran in silent mode before they decided to deploy it in the real world. And what they found was a systematic error that could have resulted in very poor care had they gone ahead and implemented it without running it in this silent mode. And I'll talk a little bit more about that silent mode. So what we know is that technical performance in silico, or in this data set, is not sufficient to support a belief that a model will work in a clinical environment. And so really this good technical performance, like looking at accuracy, it doesn't help us navigate some of the uncertainty that surrounds questions about whether or not we should integrate an AI tool. How we've managed uncertainty includes things like randomized controlled trials. These are historically the strongest form of evidence and needed in AI to verify a beneficial effect. And so one of the questions we might ask is, should we do randomized controlled trials to decide whether or not we should integrate an AI tool? Do we need to do that every time for every model at every hospital site? So obviously these are at the top of the evidentiary food chain, notwithstanding a lot of, I think, very legitimate criticisms about whether this is always the appropriate source of evidence. What we do know is that they provide the most reliable foundation for a belief about whether a specific intervention directly produces a benefit to patients under a set of pre-described conditions. And so absolutely, it would be valuable to establish that kind of knowledge for whether or not a given AI tool can produce benefit. But we obviously know that we probably can't do a full randomized clinical trial for every single type of AI that we're doing, nor would that necessarily be appropriate to every single type of AI that we're looking at. So if you think about things like, using note-taking methods, would that be suitable to a randomized controlled trial? Maybe not. But an alert system, should we do a randomized controlled trial? Maybe so. But how do we actually decide? And so one of the things that we've thought about is whether or not, when we look at whether or not to do a clinical trial, one of the things that we have to think about is whether that technical performance is reasonable for us to determine whether or not equipoise obtains. So a brief history about equipoise. As many people might know, this is traditionally the foundation for whether or not you're ethically justified in doing a randomized controlled trial. And originally, this was described as a state of genuine uncertainty about the relative merits of a given intervention relative to the current standard. And so Freed initially envisioned this as existing within the mind of an individual clinician. Friedman then expanded this by saying that clinical equipoise describes a state of uncertainty which exists within the medical community as a whole, not necessarily the individual. So he felt that it wasn't enough for an individual clinician to be reasonably uncertain that a new intervention would work. He felt that there needed to be some degree of consensus within the medical community that something could be better. Miller and Veyer said that research ethics committees, or HRECs, apply equipoise to determine whether or not a given research endeavor is ethical. And then my colleague and collaborator, Alex John London, has proposed this integrative approach to equipoise. So when should we do a trial? Well, it's when we can generate socially valuable information and the welfare of participants is safeguarded. So one of the examples that I like to give is that there's this very strange anecdote about me, which is that I have a history of insomnia. And one of the weirdest things that has worked for me when I'm in the middle of the night and I can't sleep, I drink a can of Coke. And for some reason, this calms me down somehow and I go straight to sleep. Now, could I go ahead and say, okay, we should do a randomized controlled trial to assess whether Coca-Cola is a potential intervention for insomnia? Probably not. There's not a, reasonable state of uncertainty within the medical community that would be good. It's just kind of a weird thing. And so we wouldn't have the ethical justifiability to do a trial in that case, even though I could probably come up with some, mechanism by which this might work. Similarly with COVID-19 vaccines, there's a point at which we have to halt the trials because we have ample evidence that they work. So then again, clinical equipoise is disturbed when we have certainty that an intervention will actually work and help people. Some of the things that equipoise is not, this is a term that is in the colloquial vernacular as well as in the research ethics literature. And some people kind of say, it's an individual's own uncertainty about the merits of a new intervention, which it's not. Some people also think that it's, a clinician being 50-50 on a new intervention versus standard of care. And it's also not a gut instinct about will or will not work. Equipoise is actually applied as more of a formal test in a research ethics setting. And so with Alex John London, he described how we need to use equipoise as a means to generate socially valuable information while ensuring the welfare of our research participants. So he says there's a special concern for basic interests. So an individual's determination of whether or not they will accept the risks in the interest of advancing scientific knowledge is why we obtain consent for randomized controlled trials. Because we don't know if something will work or not, an individual has to make the decision about whether or not they will accept the risks of deviating from, a standard of care intervention. We also look at no unnecessary risks, so we should only do what is required to generate the desired information about whether or not the intervention is superior. And then we can also look at equipoise as a practical test. So would a reasonable proportion of the relevant experts find the intervention to have merit? And I'll talk a little bit about how we can apply that in a health system. So when we turn to AI, this no unnecessary risk component is really important. Now, clinical trials with AI will involve a change to the delivery of care. And there's a level of uncertainty around what this will entail. So it might be that we're changing the timing of an intervention. It might be that we're changing the type of intervention or the quality or character of the care that patients receive. Now, we know from the literature that AI tools particularly can carry a risk of automation bias, which is actually potentially exacerbated by explainability. And so what I mean by that is that sometimes clinicians will defer to any AI-based tool when they feel that the AI tool might know better than they do. And sometimes when we actually try to give explanations about why a particular prediction happened, we have increasing evidence that this might actually worsen a clinician's likelihood of accepting an incorrect prediction. We also know about the risks of unfairness. So, case after case has shown that any pattern of health inequity within society can be replicated with these AI tools and then produced at scale. And we see again and again that a lot of times clinicians as individuals actually reduce some of this in making their own decisions. And so if we automated a lot of this, it actually becomes worse than it would with clinicians. There's also the risk of additional burdens. So every time we add something to the health system, we might add time, we might change our cognitive loading, And we're asking people to adopt a new technology, which involves something else that they need to take up in the context of them, trying to deliver care to the patient. There's also risks related to the generalizability of models. So what might work at a local academic health institution might not work at a rural setting. And so the risk will be different depending on where we are and how we ground our decisions about what risk entails is highly local. And so the next criterion we can look at is socially valuable information. So would initiating a clinical trial with AI provide socially valuable information? Well, one of the things that we know is whether or not an AI tool is superior to the standard of care actually requires evaluating more than technical performance alone. We also need to look at that workflow integration aspect. We need to look at human-computer interaction. We need to look at fairness and bias. All of these things can independently limit whether or not the tool is actually valuable. And this is all, in addition to and beyond the model's predictive accuracy. Without thinking about these things beforehand, a clinical trial can have a very high risk of a type 2 error. And this is something this was back in 2007 by the study by Campbell and colleagues who studied complex interventions. And one of the things that they found is that when we don't do enough preclinical work and sufficiently have a good level of precision in how we design our clinical trial, we can both take up something that doesn't actually work, and we can reject something that might actually work for a smaller subset of patients. And a perfect example of this is some of the advanced health screening tools. So if we, applied bowel cancer screening to every single person in the Australian population, it probably wouldn't have a great yield. And we can have a lot of people who might have a lot of anxiety about, a potentially malignant result when we know a lot of them might be benign. Similarly with whole body scans, we find things in our bodies not infrequently. Most of them won't actually be a problem. And so these screening tools, really their value is when we are precise about what population we're applying them to and when we're actually applying them to that population. So coming back to equipoise and AI integration, as we've said, technical performance doesn't supply the needed information to inform our judgment about whether or not equipoise obtains. But initiating a clinical trial on the basis of technical performance alone can introduce these novel and uncertain risks. And it also might fail to provide socially valuable information about the actual benefit of the AI tool relative to the current standard. So if that's true, what evidence base should the community of experts rely upon to determine whether or not equipoise obtains, and what methods can we use to generate that evidence base? And this is where the translational or silent trial comes in. So a quick note about this. Silent trial is the term that is used throughout the literature in machine learning. This is a term that's been around, for nearly a decade now. And when I've used this, particularly with colleagues who are in, marginalized communities, there's a lot of tension around this term silent. And so one of the things that we've looked at is if this term is causing tension, we need to look at that carefully. The second component, as I'll talk about, is that the term silent doesn't actually capture all of what we think should go on during this phase. So what is a silent trial? A silent trial is when a validated model, meaning one that has good technical performance, is implemented into a live clinical environment, but without affecting care delivery. So it's run in real time, but in silent mode. So the way that, my phone is on silent right now, there are still alerts coming through to my phone, but I'm not seeing them. I review them later. We can do the same thing with AI models. So a model will run inference on a patient incoming to the hospital, but the predictions go to a research team rather than the clinical team. So they don't change care. Those predictions are then collected by the research team and then assessed against what actually happens to the patient so that we can establish the real world performance of the tool. So silent trial then is effectively a prospective but non-interventional evaluation of the model's technical performance in the integration context. Now, as I've said, that's only part of the story. even doing technical performance in a prospective setting is not enough. We still need to look at these aspects of workflow. We need to look at human-computer interaction, fairness, and bias. And so we're using the term translational trial to indicate that we're expanding this to consider AI as a socio-technical intervention in the integration context. So by translational trial, we're zooming out to include model performance, but including the full package of things that need to go into our evaluation. And so my colleagues and I at Sick Kids had initially developed this pathway for bringing AI from the bench to the bedside, where we looked at initial design and development, followed by this silent or translational trial phase. And then on the basis of that information, that would help us decide what form of prospective clinical evaluation would happen. Would it be a direct integration? Would we do an observational trial? Would we do a randomized controlled trial? And it's great to see that there's emerging consensus around this framework. The Salient framework, which was developed out in Queensland, is another really excellent pathway that aligns really well with our work here. And across the United States, at mature AI institutions, this is a pretty accepted term. And so where it fits in is that we have this kind of a lot of work in the responsible AI field. So what makes a good algorithm? We also have work around clinical trials. So Decide AI is first in human reporting guidelines, Spirit and Consort for randomized control trials. And then we have more and more work on post-integration monitoring. But really, the silent trial is this phase in between responsible AI and clinical trial conduct. Now, when we say socio-technical evaluation, what we're talking about is essentially an intervention ensemble. So much in the same way that if I gave you a drug and said, this is a safe drug, it's been approved by the TGA for treatment of diabetes, you can use it to help your patients. I actually haven't told you anything that will actually help you use that to benefit a patient. You would need to know the dose. You would need to know whether it was evaluated in pediatrics or adults, at what stage of disease, what are the side effects, all of these things. And so if we think about AI tools as an element of an intervention ensemble, we can then focus on the constellation of practices surrounding that AI tool that together provide that evidentiary foundation for clinicians to use AI tools responsibly. And so this includes things like the operations, the IT processes, looking at environmental impact of models, embedding patient engagement, as well as legal and risk, in order to develop the best package of information together to help us use this in the most ethically defensible way. And so again, we see a lot of evidence that these tools, whether or not they work, depends on more than this technical performance. And one of the canonical cases by Madeline Claire Ellish and colleagues was in one of the first integrations of Sepsis Watch, which was a tool at Duke University in the US. They found that the model's performance was quite good, but actually no patient would have benefited if it were not for the nurses who had to review those alerts, call up a clinician who maybe it was in the middle of the night, maybe they weren't worried about that patient, but that nurse had to convince that physician to actually go to the bedside and check on the patient. And if it weren't for the work of those nurses, that model might not have worked. So it really highlights the fact that we need to look at this full picture. So what does this actually look like in practice? A patient will come into the hospital, their information is recorded through the EHR. The model would make a prediction at the desired point in the workflow. So if we're trying to predict, whether or not a patient is going to develop sepsis on the basis of their initial triage, we need to be making the prediction at that point and recording its performance at that point. The prediction is recorded by the research team. And then we observe and we record the actual patient outcome. Was the prediction accurate? And then for which patients? So looking at those fairness aspects, we can look at different subgroups. During this phase, we can also do user testing for other integration aspects. So looking at human-computer interaction and that interpretability or explainability. What we want to do is assess, first of all, how do clinicians actually want to receive this information? Should it come through the EHR? Sometimes people use an app. Who is going to receive that alert? What is it going to look like? Are you going to give a numerical score? Is it going to be, red orange, yellow, what other information accompanies that, and looking at whether those aspects potentially have an independent influence on what the clinician might do with that information. Then we have to look at the relevant conditions and boundaries. So as an example, some of the tools that we've used in the ICU at Sick Kids Hospital, we find that they work really well on patients in the main pediatric ICU, but we also have a cardiac ICU where a lot of those models would just be constantly alerting because that population of patients already has cardiac issues. So depending on what your patient cohort looks like, you might need to actually refine on which patients that model is appropriate to be used. And so the product of the translational trial really is defining this intervention ensemble that we can now test prospectively. So because we're not changing anything, we're still only having descriptive evidence of the model's performance. But we've got this package of information that we can now systematically test. And so during this phase, we're establishing the evidentiary foundation for equipoise. If a model fails during this silent trial, we can quickly discard it without having risk patient care, without wasting our clinicians' time and resources and learning a new system, without taking up institutional resources like our IT teams. And so this fits the criterion of reducing unnecessary risk. And then it also provides a more precise direction for the clinical trial, which stands a better chance of producing socially valuable knowledge about an AI tool's potential impact on a particular outcome. And in this way, we're meeting the social value criterion outlined by Alex London. How can equipoise actually help us make these integration decisions? Some of the things we might navigate are, should we use integration be direct implementation with monitoring? Should we do a randomized controlled trial? Should we do an observational or quasi-interventional trial? And this can be useful for research ethics committees as well as senior decision makers in navigating this uncertainty about how we actually integrate AI tools. So we can highlight this through a series of case examples by applying equipoise as a combination of welfare and social value criteria. This was one of the tools from Sick Kids that was developed. This was a model that detected central line accesses in the ICU. We called it the shark fin symbol because it had this kind of predictable little shark fin type representation. And so during a translational trial, what the team was doing was actually visually observing the line accesses by the nursing teams, as well as the signal prediction by the model. Now, the way that the status quo would go is that a nurse would manually record when they had accessed the central line. And so because this was part of a series of procedures and they might have a number of patients, there was not a high correlation between when the nurse was annotating this in the chart and when they actually accessed the line. However, the shark fin symbol happened at the exact moment that they accessed the line, and it was very, very reliable. And we found it was much, much better than the nurse's manual entry into the electronic medical record. So we thought, could we actually just directly integrate this and continue to monitor for it? Well, looking at the welfare criterion, there's not actually an intervention to patients per se, so there's not unnecessary risk to the individual. And then social value. So whether the evidence that we got during the translational trial was already quite sufficiently compelling. So if we had done an RCT, it wouldn't really have changed anyone's opinion because we could see quite apparently that it was better than what we were doing before. And so in this case, in collaboration with the Research Ethics Board, the team made the decision to proceed to direct integration with monitoring for this tool. Second case example is prognostication of severe brain injury. This is not a real use case that we've used anyway. But a lot of people have an interest in outcome prediction models to determine the likelihood of patient mortality. And they might use those to inform decisions such as withholding or withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments. So during the translational trial, you might want to look at the ability of the model to correctly predict the mortality of individual patients. You might be able to assess how well the model is correctly predicting whether or not a patient is likely to perish. So when we look at whether we could do a randomized control trial, which would entail, potentially randomizing patients to whatever the AI tool recommends or not, when we look at the welfare criterion, we know that it's not ethically justifiable to randomize patients to actually test this. There's not only the matter of the kind of fragile foundation of outcome prediction models, but patients' choices on life-sustaining treatments are something that is, really preserved at a core within our society. And so we can't actually randomize patients to that. It would not be ethically appropriate. However, we would actually produce socially valuable information because we would know for sure if an AI made a prediction that a patient would die, and then we made a decision, we would have reliable information. And so when we look solely at the welfare criterion, we know that, that as a determining step, we would say that this is inappropriate. And so in this case, if we really wanted to test this model, a non-interventional trial might be preferable, where we preserve patients' rights to make decisions about their end-of-life care. Final case is a diagnostic test for hip dysplasia. So this is a team in South Australia who's looking at this, where they want to use an AI tool to detect hip dysplasia among infants based on video images. So a translational trial would test the ability to detect hip dysplasia using video under a variety of conditions and at different locations, because the idea is that you would do this out in rural clinics. If we look at the welfare criterion, we think that the intervention has a reasonable chance of offering a better approach to care delivery because we know that there are such significant delays with infants receiving this attention at a tertiary care center. And then social value. So a clinical trial would provide the necessary information to warrant a shift to AI-supported referrals or to maintain the current standard of care. So if we did a clinical trial, we would come out with one of two results. We would either see that, using AI to detect this more early might not actually change the benefit to risk ratio for patients. Or we would find that actually these early referrals are facilitating better outcomes for infants. That would allow us to make the decision whether or not we should scale this and whether this would become a new standard of care. And so during that translational trial, if we see that it's performing well across those locations, we know that there's potential benefit to improve standard of care, we know that we can produce socially valuable information with an RCT, then we would be able to conduct that RCT. So Project Canary is a project that is about managing uncertainty. And so we look at translational trials as the canary in the coal mine. So if you've heard the story about canaries in the coal mines, these were, birds that miners would take into the mine because the canary was more sensitive to disturbances in the air quality. And so they would actually become sick when the air quality was deteriorating, and that would alert the miners to actually getting out of the mines. Miners became quite attached actually to these canaries. They even fashioned little canary respirators to try and revive them. And so we like this image because we think that it speaks to this reciprocity between the person and the intervention in a way that I think is very true of AI systems. And so, as I said, there's this case study where this translational trial did act as a canary in the coal mine and prevented this team from integrating a model that could potentially have worsened care in the way that we saw some of those kind of, scare cases from the initial slides. And so one of the questions that we have in this work is, how do we actually do this systematically and incorporate into AI governance? A lot of people are doing silent trials, but they're primarily focusing on them as another prospective technical performance indicator. And so Project Canary really zooms out for this focus on translational trials. We're also interested in providing guidance to health institutions for how we can all conduct this, because we view it as a core capability of any institution that wants to use AI tools. And so we have a piece on Medium. We also have a piece forthcoming in Nature Medicine about the full protocol for this project. But the goal of Project Canary is to generate normative guidance and define best practices for translational trials that are evaluating AI tools. And this is my co-lead, Dr. Xiao Liu from University of Birmingham. And so what we're doing to undertake this project is first we want to map current practices with respect to how silent trials are being conducted worldwide. We're using that term because that's the term in the literature. We then want to use this to develop guidance documents that are actionable and accessible for diverse healthcare institutions. So whether you are a large hospital in Sydney or you are out in rural Goolwa in South Australia, we want to make sure that this guidance is actionable for all health institutions. And we want to identify opportunities to integrate these practices into organizational accountability, such as our national safety and health quality service standards, into regulatory oversight, such as the TGA, as well as consumer education. So thinking about how to provide consumers with information about what's done during these translational trials so that a consumer can make an educated choice about whether or not the use of that tool aligns with their values, whether they want to participate in a clinical trial, or what questions they might have on the basis of that information. So overall, I hope I've conveyed that technical performance alone doesn't provide the necessary ethical foundation for making decisions about AI integration. I've argued that the translational trial considers the AI tool as a socio-technical intervention and permits the collection of socially valuable information without introducing risk to patients. Which means that the translational trial is the relevant paradigm to inform equipoise and provide a foundation for making decisions about AI integration through forms of prospective clinical evaluation. So thank you very much to the Hospital Research Foundation, and a lot of the work for this workshop was supported by the K&L Gates Initiative in Ethics and Computational Technologies, and this was initially presented at the Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. So thank you. We've got 15 minutes for questions, and I'm super excited to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Melissa. That was so interesting. Really excellent presentation. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? Feel free to either pop them in the chat or you can raise your hand and take yourself off mute, turn on your camera. Monica, you have a question? Hi.
Thank you so very much, Melissa, for that excellent presentation. That was really great. I was wondering, you mentioned all the different various guidelines that are already out there. Where will yours fit in and how do you see all of them integrated? Because there's a multitude of guidelines, and I think TGA even is doing a consultation at the moment where they list them all and they consider them with regards to their legislation or procedures, I guess, on how they should regulate all this. So yeah, where does yours fit in? Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. So from a regulatory perspective, we have a couple of partners from the TGA who are supporting us in this. And one of the things that we've identified, I think, within the TGA, as well as the FDA in the United States, as well as Health Canada, and even the International Medical Device Regulators Forum in the UK, there is a increasing recognition that we need clinical evidence to support regulatory approval, but no one is quite sure yet what form that will take. So if you look at, how the FDA, I think, particularly has relied a lot on technical performance alone and is either clearing devices or approving devices on the basis only of retrospective information, they're starting to realize that that's not correct. At the same time, we also know not every situation is going to call for a randomized controlled trial. And so they're trying to figure out what's the in-between. And I think one of the, the NICE guidelines on digital health technologies, I think actually has a really good overview of this. And so where Canary would fit in is primarily we're looking at providing guidance to health institutions. So myself as, AI director at Women's and Children's, I look at this as what's the information that I would need to know to be able to say, okay, yes, let's do a clinical trial, or yes, let's do an observational trial, or yes, let's integrate. But we also recognize that potentially the components of Project Canary might be elements that the regulators could use to actually look at the evidence base for some of these tools. And I think that gets into kind of another complicated question, which is whether or not it would be feasible for the TGA to regulate every AI tool at every health institution, which I think would be very complicated and very hard to scale. Notwithstanding, we know we need something. And so one of the things that I've been looking at particularly is whether there are aspects of Project Canary that could align with the National Safety and Health Quality Service standards. And so whether we might actually specify what a health institution, what information they would need to have in order to be accountable under, for example, Standard 1 clinical governance, looking at the evidence base, patient and quality systems. So I think it's still very much an evolving area, not just in Australia, but everywhere. This is still like a really new concept to people. And so I see it really kind of fitting in as guidance rather than sort of a reporting guideline sort of thing. It's intended to be an actionable kind of toolkit for people to conduct their own evaluations.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. Tilly, you've got your hand up.
Thanks very much, Melissa. That was excellent. This question may be a little bit left of field. However, this is the first time I've heard equipoise used in this context, and I just think it is such a good concept to apply when we're, proposing studies. Do you know if it's used in other contexts outside of AI?
Yeah, this was something that originated in randomized clinical trials and is typically used in drug trials. We have also used it I'm still actually a member of the ATREC at Sick Kids Hospital. And so some of the ways that we've applied AI or that we've applied equipoise are for things like gene therapies or novel therapeutics, where we might not have a big evidence base. And so we have to look at, using equipoise in a context where we might not have a large community of experts, or we might not have a huge amount of evidence. And so really, I think equipoise helps us look really carefully at how we are thinking about our level of certainty about whether or not something can work or not. I think particularly in the AI space, there is a lot of belief and a lot of hope without necessarily having a really strong reason for it other than the tool can predict well. And so I remember, kind of thinking about this a while back. I was actually in my research ethics course when I was doing my master's in bioethics. And we were talking about equipoise, as this concept that's been used for decades now with HREX. And I remember thinking, I think this could actually really be applied to AI. And I'm seeing in the chat, equipoise is used in the field of shared decision making too. That's really interesting. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah. Thanks, Tilly. And Swapna, you had a question as well?
Yes, thank you, Alison. And thank you, Melissa. It was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much. I just wanted to understand where in your mind pragmatic clinical trials sort of fit in that continuum of care with the silent translational trials. And there's another question that I wanted to find out about is, will the Canary project framework talk about specifics of how to actually integrate that socio-technical aspect more? So how does an AI algorithm alert fit into the workflow? How does it sit with the consumers? So who does what? And is that actually going to work in clinical practice?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So for kind of the last aspect, what we're really hoping to work closely with different health systems, because we're always going to be balancing that issue of resources. Not everybody's going to have like a full kind of team. And so when we look at kind of zooming out on the translational trial aspect, some of the human factors components are really, really important. And so basically in Project Canary, we know that we've got a lot of information around the technical aspects. And then I'm very fortunate to work with my colleague Carolyn Semler here at University of Adelaide, who's a cognitive scientist, as well as a number of other people in the human factors space, where they are looking at this kind of the body of evidence around these workflow considerations, around the human-computer interaction components.
Mm.
And so what we're hoping that we can do is kind of strike a balance between providing recommendations about what kinds of evaluations should be conducted and how you might go about doing them so that they are actionable for a health system. Now, one of the tensions with that, obviously, is that, again, kind of there's that resourcing aspect, but then there's also, do you need to do that for every single trial? So, and there might be different considerations. So if you're purchasing a tool off the shelf, someone might have already decided how the interface is going to look. So in that case, Project Canary might look at what do we know about how that evaluation was conducted? Might we need to kind of vet that with our clinicians, whether this is something that resonates with them, whether this is the way that they want to see it. Sometimes vendors will also allow you to make modifications to how the model is presented. So we anticipate that we're going to have to be working with a really kind of diverse set of cases. And so it's not just that. So we're primarily hoping to provide guidance about that evaluation, but then also provide some guidance about when evaluation needs to be done and under what conditions, if that makes sense.
And the
Great, thank
pragmatic, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Yes, you asked about yeah. So yeah, I see when I like to use the term prospective clinical evaluation because I think that there's such a diversity of types of AI tools that we're going to be evaluating that really it's a spectrum. It's all the way from direct integration to multi-site randomized international controlled trial, and everything in between fits in. And so what we might look at, there's a lot of papers on when is it ethically justifiable to do a pragmatic trial. And so that, I think all of that core literature stands, and we'd simply kind of be looking to signal, here's some of the AI specific considerations for when a pragmatic trial might be the best choice, or what you might need to think about, what are the risks and benefits of doing it. And I think that also kind of comes into play when we're thinking about what different investigators might want. So we've had some cases where actually an observational trial would have been fine, but the investigator says, well, actually, I want to see if this independently is better. And so that also affects the type of evaluation that they would conduct.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now I'm conscious we've got 3 minutes left. So Tan, do you have a very quick question?
I'm not sure if it's quick, but thanks for the presentation. It's mostly around to do with the issues around ethics and ethics approaches to applying AI, and I'm working on a project to do something that I guess resonates with the silent trial. And I guess some of the contention at the moment is what constitutes as a prospective or a clinical trial under the definition of the purposes for ethics. And I think that's been the challenge depending on the level of I guess the product itself and the level of risk as well. So any I guess perspectives on how to navigate I guess the differences in what ethics approaches we would take to I guess ensure that whatever evaluation we wanted to do is obviously capturing the population we want, but not necessarily have issues around generalizability, particularly around randomized clinical trials.
Yeah, no, great point. Yeah. And I think I think this is a space where we have a lot of again, there's kind of a spectrum. There's some people who are very technically focused and will pull ethics out of the very technical aspects. And then there's very high level ethics where, it's a little disjointed from the actual math of the stuff, right? And I really see the kind of optimal ethics approaches being in the middle. So I think that our how we assess risk needs to be based on some empirical information. right? We can't simply assume that an AI will carry particular risks, without actually measuring the performance of the specific tool. I don't think we can say that there's almost nothing you can say about all AI tools that actually applies to all AI tools, right? So I think that we need to be focused on how we look at the specific tool in question. And then one of the things that always kind of impacts me about risk, which I find quite challenging, is that I've heard anecdotally from a lot of my colleagues, particularly in radiology, that something will be described as low risk because it's intended to inform, but a clinician or a health institution will actually use it to directly manage. And so then what we think is the risk is actually not, because of the way that it's being used. And so that's something that we're trying to navigate right now. And I think there's a real opportunity to provide some better guidance on that, because I think that, yeah, I think that we've got to get a little bit closer in the use case to how we've measured the thing. And so if it is just inform, you can't use it to, replace or automate or anything like that.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you so much, everyone, for the questions and discussion afterwards. I had, as the chair, you listen to the presentation and think of questions to ask, but yours were all much better than the ones I had. It was such a clear presentation. Thank you, Melissa, again for your time today. And just a reminder, so the recording of this presentation will be made available on our website, and you should be notified when it's available through the Health Services Research Association newsletter. If you're not a member, or you don't have to be a member to get the newsletter, feel free to pop onto the website and sign up so that you know when the recording's available. I also did just want to do a very quick plug for the Health Services Research Conference, which is coming up the 4th to the 6th of December in Brisbane. We have just announced that the early bird registrations have been extended for a week to the 16th of October. If you would like to come along, the theme of the conference is Health Services Research in a Digital Age. So lots of research being presented about sort of digital health space. And I had a quick look at the program. There's quite a few presentations about AI, including people presenting a couple of AI algorithms, but there's also sort of cost effectiveness work, patient preferences, clinicians' perspectives, qualitative work. So it should be a really great program if you wanted to come along. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. Thank you again, Melissa, for the really great presentation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Bye.